Welcome to the ILI Project Finance and African Perspective webinar. This is part of our COVID-19 webinar series. The ILI offers training and technical assistance to governments, government officials, and private practitioners from around the world. The ILI and its global affiliates have trained over 39,000 participants from over 185 countries over our 65 years. We offer a number of training seminars. Most relevant to our session today is our PPP Financial Risk Analysis Seminar, which runs from November 16th to 20th. We also have a PPP Infrastructure Finance Seminar and a PPP Infrastructure Finance for Lawyers Seminar, which runs December 7th through 18th. You can learn more about all of our seminars, all of our webinars in the ILI at www.ili.org. We're fortunate to have Audrey Mwala here today to lead the session. Audrey is a fellow chartered management accountant. She's a certified PPP specialist, also a certified project finance specialist. She has a degree in accounting and an MBA. She currently leads the Malawi PPP Commission. She's the founder of Sycamore Consult, a consulting firm. She's delivered trainings in Dubai, South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi. Fantastic resource for us here today. Audrey, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody, from wherever you are. I know we have people here from different parts of the world, Africa, Europe, America. It's a great honor that I can have this chance to talk to you on this topic of project finance. But you will notice that we will emphasize on the perspective of Africa. I want to, first of all, just give you a perspective of what Africa infrastructure looks like before we go into what actually project finance is and the mechanics that go into it. To begin with, it is extremely important that we should start with the understanding that for any development to happen, you need certain fundamental infrastructure to be available in place. I am thinking about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where before you can begin to think of bigger goals, your ambitions, your self-actualization, your immediate needs have to be met first. You need to survive, you need to have food. So the basic infrastructure framework of a person has to be laid down first. And upon which that basic infrastructure of the psychology of an individual, now it allows the person to think and come up with the architectural design of their infrastructure of life. And so is the case with development of any nation. For us to develop as Africa, there is need to ensure that the basic infrastructure that we need is there. Then we can now begin to talk about economic growth. We can talk about poverty reduction, and probably not just reduction, but eradication altogether. But unfortunately, Africa is lagging behind in terms of infrastructure development, in spite of its importance to development. And that's why there is a big gap in the infrastructure, in the development of Africa compared to many nations. We are looking at gaps in the very, very key infrastructure areas. You have the telecom, you have the power, water supply, ICT, sanitation, just to name a few, education, health. All these are challenges that Africa is lagging behind in terms of infrastructure development. The other issue is that at the moment, we have a very, very high population growth. It's very, very rapid. So in terms of the numbers in growth, Africa is growing very rapidly, but there's also another aspect of urbanization, where people that were contented with the simple or infrastructure that was available, or the simple or no infrastructure that was available in their home villages, are moving to urban areas where they also want to be serviced with the infrastructure that is already a challenge to the existing the citizens. So as a result, there is so much pressure on the infrastructure of the nation. There are so many challenges that even in our country, when I was growing up as a child, compared to the infrastructure that we have here, there is very little that has been added in terms of our water, our electricity. So we are now having to scramble on the very, very same infrastructure, sharing the cake into smaller and smaller pieces. So it is very, very difficult that the migrants from the villages are also looking for the same infrastructure. So it's very difficult for the governments or the different bodies owned by government to provide existing citizens the necessary connection to infrastructure, and let alone coping up with the new users who are coming in the city. There is an urgent need of infrastructure in Africa. Out of the population of 1.2 billion people, unfortunately, more than half of the population lack access to electricity. In our country, Malawi, we actually are around 10% of the population that is connected to electricity. So as you can see, the problem is actually very, very big. 5 out of 6 people in most countries in Africa don't have access to piped water. Some people draw water from a borehole. Some have to travel to some place where there is a water connection and queue in a line for long. And worse still, there are some people that have to get water from just a well and treated water. So just about 16% only of the African population has got access to piped water, and the 68% that has got access to water, some of it, this group is not necessarily having water in their homes, but this is a group that I'm talking about, that they have to walk to find water. And a quarter has got no drinking water available. They just have to make their own wells and drink from there. So roughly about 700 million people in Africa do not have decent sanitation facilities. And this is risky in terms of the health status of the nation. So as you can see, that the challenges that we have are about access. But just the problem is not just about access, it is also the cost of it. Sadly, while Africa doesn't have a lot of people that has got high buying power, it has to pay even twice for the price of the infrastructure service that other nations pay. It is expensive because of many reasons. The logistics part of it, the planning part of it makes it expensive. The inefficiencies that go with it makes it expensive to provide the infrastructure, and as such, citizens have to bear the cost of that high infrastructure. In terms of Africa, I want to share the challenges that we have in the energy sector. There is booming population, urbanization, and ambitious economic development. But unfortunately, all these demand energy. Energy poverty is a very big problem that makes more than 600 million people in Africa lack electricity. There's a problem even for the day-to-day requirements for cooking. It is not possible for a number of people to access cooking fuel from the energy which they could have received from the power companies. So there is insufficient power. Also, in the day, you don't have enough power for the whole day oftentimes, resorting to expensive power like generators for those that can afford, and unhealthy power for people that cannot afford generation, that is involved with smoke and that is hazardous to health. Not only do we have insufficient power in terms of the power rationing that happens? But also there are some industries that are failing to take off the ground simply because there is no power to support their enterprise. So it is so difficult for us as a nation to attain our sustainable goals, the Africa Agenda of 2016, without us having power, because we need it to develop. Reaching our full electricity access by 2030, the 2030 agenda in sub-Saharan Africa is going to be a challenge that has got a price tag of roughly about $100 billion per year in investment. And this amount is actually estimated to be 5 times what is being spent here. And as you can see, there is indeed a very big financing gap. If you look at the graph here, I will not go into much of the detail, but what I wanted to show is the fact that there is the color blue, which represents a combination of energy that is being generated from domestic resources compared to foreign resources or foreign investors. So if you look down here, this color pink represents what Middle and East and North Africa is investing in power from their domestic resources. Compare that with Asia, their investment from domestic. Compare that with Europe and Asia and Latin America, and this is what African governments are investing in energy. The other part, which is slightly red, is what is being invested by foreigners. So the point is that there is a big gap in infrastructure development that can benefit from private sector financing if we have to develop the power sector. In terms of the use of energy, in Africa, we are using very, very little energy because of availability as well as affordability. Except South Africa, but an average person in sub-Saharan Africa consumes around 200 kilowatt hours of electricity compared to 1,142 in North Africa and about 4,000 the same in South Africa. And the figure is much more even on the world average, as you can see the different graphs that I have put here for MENA and the other world comparatives. So in other words, because we are not using electricity enough, it means we are not productive enough, because electricity is the base for production, for productivity. In terms of ICT access, the story is the same. Internet access is very low, and it is worse to places that are outside the capital city. And it is worse because of the population affordability, but also the aspect of ICT, of electricity. Because ICT equipment will rely on power backup. And that causes many Africans fail to enter into the internet world, where development is faster by utilizing ICT. In Nigeria, they had 123 million internet users. And second to that is Egypt. And as you can see that in Africa, these are the countries that look like they are doing well in terms of the usage of internet. Usage of ICT. So with the less than a third of the population having access to ICT, again, achieving our goals by 2030 are going to be a challenge, is going to be a great challenge, and will require about $100 billion to invest. And this investment is not only in the infrastructure, but it will also be required in the actual soft skills, the usage of the infrastructure. It will be required that we should also learn to teach different players on how to use ICT itself. So a skills gap is another challenge that we have to deal with in Africa when it comes to infrastructure development in the ICT. Of critical importance that we are struggling with is actually water. As they say, water is life. And without water, it is very difficult to develop. I would actually say, if you look at the ranking of our infrastructure challenges, we have water and we also have electricity ranking second, and then the other infrastructure, because water is really life. So we need about $30 billion to achieve our goals. This is per year. Transport is another area where we are lagging behind. There is an estimation of 2.6 GDP growth per year if Africa had better infrastructure in the road sector. So as you can see that we are lagging behind in terms of our GDP growth, our economies, simply because we don't have the means to move goods faster, cheaper, and more efficient. There was a study that was done that tracked about 448 large-scale transport projects. This is a combination of several subsectors like roads, bridges, rail across Africa. And it was, and they were also at different stages, but then it was estimated that the total investment value of these projects would be about 430 billion US dollars. 49 of these projects were in Nigeria. And as you can see, we talked about ICT, where 123 billion people were in Nigeria. So Nigeria is really doing well in terms of ICT with 123 million. And yet this side is also doing well in terms of infrastructure projects. So it looks like Nigeria is trying to push in its infrastructure development. And interestingly, on the other side, on ICT, Egypt was ranking second, and it's the same story when it comes to the transport infrastructure. Egypt also had 20 transport projects out of the 448 projects that we just talked about. So these two countries are doing well, and then the list goes on. I will not go into detail on the list. But then there was an estimation that when completed, these projects in total, they will actually add to about 110,000 kilometers of length in the combination of the three bridges, rail, and road. And also, this was a combination of existing, which is brownfield projects, and new infrastructure as greenfield projects. So I want to talk about the infrastructure challenge in Africa. The real challenge that we have in Africa emanates from our dwindling resources in the central government. When government wants to build infrastructure, it relies on taxes. And it is a vicious cycle, I must say, that you don't have water, you don't have electricity, therefore industries will not come. So because industries are not coming to come up with new developments that can create business activity, that can create taxes, now what goes to government for taxes will also be very, very small. So it's interesting that the challenge is a vicious cycle, that if you don't fix the infrastructure, you're not going to attract the industries that will now develop businesses that will generate revenue that will be taxed to go to the government coffers for it to develop infrastructure as well. So increasingly, it is becoming difficult. And there are so many priorities and so many needs on the little resources that government is collecting. So the traditional way of financing using public sector financing is really not enough. And it is not even enough for operations of the existing infrastructure and later on creation of new infrastructure. So it is very, very difficult. In our country, the budget that I was looking at for the current budget, it has just about 7% of our national GDP that has been allocated for infrastructure development. And that is just maybe in the developed countries, that one will be just not even enough for one project. And yet we have to spread it across several sectors. So that is the problem that we have in Africa as the infrastructure challenge. So again, high quality infrastructure is essential if we have to achieve the sustainable development goals, as well as the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. But Africa Development Bank also had listed priority areas and highlighted 5 goals. And these can only be achieved by having good infrastructure. So governments have to find innovative ways of developing infrastructure, which is affordable, and also considering that there are some poor people that may not afford to pay for the infrastructure. It is not easy. According to new estimates that were done by Africa Development Bank, they suggested that Africa needs about between 130 to 170 billion a year to bridge, to finance in infrastructure. So looking at what we have at the moment, it creates a financing gap of between 68 to 108 billion. I must say that these figures, they vary a lot. They vary maybe a bit, depending on who did the study, when the study was done. But the idea is just to give at least some estimate. An estimate of what is required. And here, what we are seeing as the message that I'm communicating is that there is a huge gap for infrastructure development, and that there is potential and available projects where private sector can come and invest in this infrastructure. In terms of the infrastructure, you can see that you have insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds that has got more than $100 trillion in assets under management globally. So you can see that just a small fraction from this 100 trillion can bridge the whole infrastructure gap. If we can just have a way, it's interesting that you have demand somewhere for infrastructure and you have availability of resources somewhere, and there's a bridge in between, which can be easily done if we utilize very well the resources that are available there and are also looking for infrastructure development projects which they can go into. So we have a number of gaps, even in health, in education, and security. There's a lot that will require infrastructure development to bridge the gap. And from what I see, especially looking at the dwindling resources in the government purse, private sector solution from Africa, homegrown pension funds could be one way to bridge the gap, and in addition to what can come from the international platform. So by attracting foreign investment firms in Africa, it will improve trade logistics, it will increase knowledge and skills and entrepreneurship, and it will also help to gain confidence for the country at the international level. So we have to also mention that much as we are complaining about the lack of infrastructure in Africa, there are already a number of countries that are using the private financing to benefit. So there are so many companies like countries like Ethiopia, Mauritius, Rwanda, including Malawi, where private sector is really making a difference. Looking at the situation in Africa, there is a big need for Africa infrastructure. As you can see, the picture that I have here, this is a real picture taken from my country, where infrastructure development in the water sector is one of the challenges that I highlighted earlier. As you can see, this is a real source of water. These people are going to drink from this place. The water they are going to use for bathing, washing, all their needs is going to come from that well, and it is not healthy. It's open, prone to anything, even animals falling in there. And as you can see, it's risky, even anybody can fall in there. But this is the reality for some people, and most people, I must say, in most parts of Africa. So the reason why I think Africa needs project finance is because in the African market, we struggle with provision of loans. There are so many restrictions, some of them that come from the regulatory requirements that comes with the Basel three requirements, where you are restricted as a commercial bank on how much you can lend out and for how long you can lend out. So like in Kenya, you can get up to 100 million, but then the tenure is only 7 years. In my country, it is 5 years, and what you can get is also less. And in Tanzania, only 30 million for 7 years as well. So mostly it's international banks that are able to issue big amounts, like $1 billion for a longer period. So in Africa, you can see that it is under investment, and this is also hampered by the challenge of finding investable projects. We have also over-relied on sovereign support, and we also have challenges in terms of our legal and regulatory framework, and it now becomes a problem to find financing and also attract investors, because we also don't have investable projects. But the projects are there. It's about the preparation and making sure that they're investable on the international market. So we've seen that development banks are becoming resourceful on how to structure deals that will address the continent's needs. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to move anywhere. It's a chicken and egg situation. Have money to prepare a project in order for you to get money to invest in the project. But now you don't have money to invest to even prepare the project. So we need to have innovative ways. So the infrastructure needs in Africa will require large scale, so that we can make them viable for economies of scale. And again, as I said, there are so many statistics in terms of how much Africa needs. The other one I talked about was about 68 to 109, and this is another one that was done by Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic, and it estimated about 93 billion annually required for the next 10 years. So which is more or less in the range of what we had. So Africa needs project finance because, as I demonstrated from that slide, that the sovereign governments cannot match the increasing demand of the infrastructure requirements. Our economy is growing slow, and it is difficult to generate enough funds in the budget, as I explained at the beginning. The Basel III issues that I explained already, and it is very, very difficult. And yet, a lot of experts see Africa institutional capacity, institution money as having a largely untapped resource that can drive infrastructure. So within here in Africa, the institutions that we have that are holding money can turn Africa the other way around. Instead of going south, it can go north. And if we have international investors to come, it will even make things better. So there was an estimate of 1.1 trillion US dollars of resources that is available by assets under management in Africa alone by management companies in different countries like Egypt, Namibia, Botswana. All this is available. So, in other words, Africa actually has the money to develop Africa, but it is sitting there under asset management. And now, can you think about if we utilize these resources productively to develop our infrastructure and then we attract more investment from outside Africa, it will be a great jump in terms of our infrastructure development. So, the local institution capacities are indeed an important source of investment in Africa. So, we have talked about the overview of the need for developing any nation, that we need to ensure that we have infrastructure. We have also talked about the challenges that we have in our key sectors. The challenges are more, but I focused only on energy, ICT, the water sector, and transport. And we have seen the estimates of the amounts that are needed in each sector. And we can also see that Africa itself has got its own self-made constraints that are making it fail to attract to attract investment, but also to structure the deals that will create investable projects where one can now put money. So we can see that looking at all that, there is a case that Africa needs private sector investment in the form of project finance, because the current resources that government gets, that Africa gets from the sovereign purse is not enough. And the challenges we have in project preparation just make it worse. And as such, there is need for project finance. So in the next session, we are going to go now into the project finance itself to understand what it is, where can you find it, where has it been used, how does it work, how do you ensure that you are able to pay back the loan that is gotten into the project finance, the structuring of the project finance, advantages and disadvantages of project finance, and also what is project finance and what is not project finance. All this we are going to cover in the next session that we will go. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much. Bye. All right, so I think we were here trying to understand what project finance is. So project finance is a means of raising non-recourse financing. Debt, I would say debt, but it also includes equity. And this is done for major projects, mostly long-term infrastructure projects. That's why I started with the infrastructure projects. And mostly they are for public service. But that doesn't mean that private projects cannot be financed. Even a company that wants to go into an expansion or a mining, they can come up with oil. You can come up with a project finance arrangement as well to finance it. So this project finance, it's non-recourse, and what it means is that the investors, the lenders, will not have any recourse on the assets of the sponsors, the original investors. Even if it is a big organization that is investing in the project, they will not be able to, the lenders cannot go, if the project goes wrong, they cannot go to the lender to seek recourse. So the risks are ring-fenced in the project and everything stays within the project. So if the lenders lose, they only lose they can only take the assets of the project. And it is also major because project finance structures are very, very complicated. So for you to do it for small projects, the economics of it wouldn't work. You invest so much in the preparation. It is also a financing which is based on the future cash flows. So you are looking at a project that does not operate any business at the moment, but then you are hoping that the future cash flows that will come will be sufficient to pay back the debt. Project finance is a financing that also depends on the detailed evaluation of the different contracts that are put together as a package. So you have a cocktail of contracts for construction, operations. You are looking at their risks, and you are also looking at the allocation of the risks between the lenders, the buyers, the investors themselves, and any other parties that are involved in the project itself. And there is a contractual agreement that binds this project financing for it to come through. There are certain key features that I want to just talk about. That project finance is something that I would want to call a faith-based lending. This is where a lender decides to take a risk and invest in something that he has never seen. Neither the owners of the projects have never seen. You all have faith that something will come out of the project. It takes a lot of faith for you to get there. That's why you go through this rigorous process of looking at the project thoroughly to ensure that you've covered all the questions that would be lingering in your mind. So you're looking at a project that doesn't exist. It has got no revenue in the first place, no track record that this has been done. The project itself is not even there, so it doesn't have any track record. You're looking at the project that has got no asset in the first place. You know, commercial lenders, they want to have their security. Here, you don't even have the asset. You are actually hoping to build an asset. It has got no employees. So it's quite interesting, really, that it's something that you are lending to something that doesn't really exist, both debtors as well, I mean, the debt lending as well as the equity. And you have the project's assets, and sometimes when the project is very, very risky, the lenders can demand secondary collateral, but ideally it's all about the project itself. It has got multiple contracts, as I said, and quite frankly, the one who calls the shots, the one who is really in control is the lender, because they are the ones who take the biggest risk. They put in so much money. So project finance is mostly used for projects that have got capital, that are capital intensive. They have upfront capital, that is, but they're also got long life so that they can pay back over a period of time. You can use project finance in greenfield projects, and the greenfield projects are just a way of saying a new project. This is a new project that was not there before. For instance, in our country, we have a PPP contract in the rural sector. It's a combination of a greenfield as well as a brownfield. So the brownfield is where you have an existing infrastructure and you're just upgrading it. But then a greenfield is where there was totally nothing at all. So we had a greenfield project for an investment for a railway from Moatiz in Mozambique, passing through Nakala and joining our existing railway line to going to Nakala. So we also have, they are also mostly used in PPPs, but as I said, you can also use in other private projects. In project finance, it is not the sponsor that borrows. The sponsor is the person that is starting the project, but it is a company that has to be set up by the sponsor and is called a special purpose vehicle. So this is the vehicle that borrows. So this is the legal entity, the legal persona of the project. And project finance is highly leveraged. I already talked about the, I think it was Christian. Christian had asked a question earlier before I started talking about how it is financed. So usually lenders will put a lot of money, probably 80% in the project. So as you can see, the project is very, very highly leveraged. You have so much money coming from the lenders. And as I said, it is non-recourse. There's also another element of bankability. This is something that is a test where you want to make sure that the net present value of the future cash flows of the project will justify the investment. You want to make sure that when you take your money that you are sinking today, and then you project the cash flows that will come in the next 10, 20 years, and then you discount them by your cost of capital, which is a combination of your cost of debt and your cost of, it's a, I would say, a weighted average costs of debt and equity. If you discount that, it's going to give you a number which is higher than the investment that you're putting. So if you have a positive NPV, then you know that you have a bankable project. But you can also test the same by looking at the internal rate of return, where you want to ensure that you have a target internal rate of return that you want. And if you have, if the project, if you discount the project using your internal rate of return, if you see that it is equal, then you know that at least you have a bankable project. So the other thing is that because project finance takes it's used mostly in long-term projects, you construct the infrastructure over a period of time, maybe 3 years. So during that time, because you don't have the money to pay back, you just capitalize the interest. So everything is capitalized and it becomes part of a construction cost. In Malawi, we are working on a project for development of 350 megawatts power. And that project is going to be developed over 4.5 years. So during the 4 years, all the interests will be capitalized. The special purpose vehicle, as I said, is an entity which is the owner of the project assets. It shields the sponsors from future failures. And as I said at the beginning, it has got no assets, and all liabilities are limited to the project special purpose vehicle. And I will show you the parties that are supposed to be seen in the special purpose vehicle, which are here below. So if you look here, this is the special purpose vehicle. But for a bank to look at this, they will ask so many questions. One, they will ask, you want to construct, what do you want to construct? So you can answer by saying, I want to construct an airport, which is here. Now, you're constructing an airport. How are you going to generate the revenue that will come to pay us off? So you have to look at the off-taker. Who is the off-taker? So it can be the general public or it can be the government. So you can look here at the contracting authority as the government that will pay this special purpose vehicle. And you need to sign a contract that you are going to take off this facility in terms of payment. At the same time, the financiers, the lenders, they want to ask, what at-risk capital do you have as a sponsor? So you need to bring in some money in here. But at the same time, you can also bring in other equity investors, small investors to come in there. The financiers, they also want to ensure that there is a contractor where they are going to take a due diligence on to make sure that they are capable of constructing a solid infrastructure. They also want to see who is going to be responsible for operating and maintenance. So once they are happy, they look at it. They also want to see now who are your suppliers of key. First, if it's you are doing a project, you want to see where does water come from, where does oil come from, where does power come from. You want to make sure that the key contracts that are necessary to make the project viable are there. And you want to also have a way of monitoring. This is something that will be done by the contracting authority as well as the lenders, because they want to see that things are done. And this monitoring by the lenders is done through the financing agreement. The lenders also do not want to take risks oftentimes by themselves. Sometimes they also find other people to bring in money. So these are called, they can bring in, you can call them subordinated debts or mezzanine. And sometimes with mezzanine, it can also be the shareholders where they bring in money in the project. And instead of all of it being equity, they can also bring loans. So this is where you can call as a subordinated debt or mezzanine finance, because it has got elements of both. It is the debt that will not be paid immediately, because in terms of priority, the big financier is the one that will be prioritized. And the mezzanine financiers, especially when they are owners of the project, they fall down on the cash flow payment. Why is project finance attractive? It is because it's clean. It doesn't involve a lot. You are just looking at the project asset and the money. It doesn't involve a lot of your other assets. And the magnitude of the project itself mostly would not fit with corporate finance. You need project finance. It is also good, attractive to have project finance because of risk diversification. There are so many parties. In fact, here, though I have talked about the construction as the construction company, but there are times when the construction company also puts in money as part of equity to also bear the risk in there. So you share the risk among many parties. And in fact, here I've talked about contracting authority as government as just the off-taker. But there are times where even government also puts a little bit of money in there. So besides the sponsor, you can see that risks are shared by different operators there. Most people like our project finance because it's off balance sheet financing. You don't have to consolidate, and most people they just invest maybe not even enough to qualify consolidation. So you can operate a business which, if it goes bad, it doesn't hit your balance sheet. It's also interesting because for most government it protects their interests in the asset, because the project financing is looking at the cash flows, not the asset itself. Even if they looked at the asset, you can imagine that if you installed the hydropower plant that we are doing here, you are coming up with a dam and things go bad and the investors they want to pack up and go, can they carry the dam? So the government, the asset will always remain with government. I remember in Australia there was a road that was constructed in Brisbane, but unfortunately things didn't go on well, and the contract collapsed. I think Joyce Malongo should be on this. She has also been in Brisbane to see this project, and the Australian government benefited. They ended up with the assets. And as I said, lenders have more control. Because you have more control by the lenders, it helps also to ensure that the project is going on well. I will go faster. The project finance has got lower agency risks because lenders are always monitoring. And the other important thing is that there's heavy due diligence that happens because it's a lot of money that goes in here and everybody really wants to be sure. I will not go into all the points, but I want to also mention that it's not all rosy about project finance. There are some disadvantages. The transaction costs are very high and it's a complex structure and it's very slow. Even the preparation, even the Patamanga projects that I'm talking about, it has taken us more than a year just to prepare. It can take you even 2 years, just project preparation. It's very, very slow. But then at the end, it is worth it because if you didn't do it, you wouldn't have had a project in the first place. As I said, it's not appropriate for small projects. Forms of financing. How do you finance project finance? As I said, it's a combination of equity, but you can also find some investors that can come as lenders from pension funds, but they can also come in as equity investors. You can also, we are constructing hostels here in Malawi using project finance, and a pension fund is bringing in equity financing in there, but they will add lending. So you can get loans from the bank. You can also combine a bit of corporate finance, but then at the end, maybe for management, they're working for capital at the end. So construction companies, as I said, they also bring in. You can come up with an infrastructure bonds, like city municipals. They can come up with a bond where they will be based, the payment will be based on the cash flows that they collect from the project, as well as what they collect from other charges which they charge as a city council. So it's the same principle with revenue bonds and also securitization, where you are actually taking your receivables and turning them into a source of payment for your project finance. Project finance has been widely used in the world and in Africa. I will just give an example. Nigeria, they've had deals, about 13 deals in 2013. Ghana, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Malawi, Uganda, Zambia, there are projects that are being used. There's an Australian company that's also invested in a graphite project in Tanzania using project finance. And in this part of the country, sub-Sahara, I mean the Africa, sub-Sahara Africa, we have one of big infrastructure projects, and I'm glad to be part of it. And I'm sure Joyce, I hope Joyce is here. She works for Vale, so it's a company that has invested in this project. It crosses two countries, Malawi and Mozambique. So it's the Nakala corridor where 5 billion was invested to develop a new railway line, and as well as construction rehabilitation of the existing line. And if you don't mind, let me just show you a little bit of this project. Yeah, so under the Nakala project, there's a bridge which is being constructed under project finance in Malawi, and this is a bridge. But besides that, there are also other activities where we are working on the railway line. This is in the southern part of Malawi. This is the railway line under construction using project finance. Those are part of the images. There is also another project to come up with a container yard for the railway line as well under this same project. This is part of the rehabilitation of the existing line to make sure that it's in modern. Yeah, so I think the company has got some corporate social responsibilities that they are doing, like employing students from university, some of the SOE things that they are doing there, farm institute, the water, the supporting agriculture. I think just to show you a few examples of what they are doing, but I will stop here. Let's go back to the presentation. Can you see the slide?
No, we can't yet.
Okay.
Now we can.
Now we do.
All right. All right, so I think I've talked about where project finance has been used. So that's another list. I will not go through it, but as you can see, our country, Malawi, is also part of the beneficiaries there in the use of project finance. I want to talk about the prerequisites for project finance. There isn't shortage of money from my research of project finance, but the investability of the projects is the issue. And also affordability of the project is the issue. So if we can address the investability by making sure that the project is well prepared, as well as ensure that we have got mitigation measures to close the gap to make the project affordable. This is another topic that I wouldn't go into detail now, but then if a project is not affordable, there are ways of making it affordable. If the project is not investable, there are also ways of making it investable. So I think these are some of the things that are prerequisites. So it has to be affordable, both to the users, or if it is government, is to the government itself. And it has to be commercially viable. And you also want to ensure that you have proper legal and regulatory framework for the project to operate on. And you also, where it is a PPP, you want to make sure that government is involved of the host country to guarantee some of the part of the transactions. The other issue is also about DFIs. When DFIs come, they do provide confidence that the project can be prepared, but it can also provide confidence. Currency issues is also another issue that is important. If you don't have a currency that can easily be converted, it becomes a challenge. So I wanted to look at why project finance should come to Africa. As I said, that Africa is untapped, I must say. Maybe it's unstarted in terms of infrastructure development. So there is a huge demand. The demographics, we have a young population growing, and the demand is there. Middle class is also expanding. Urbanization is coming as an issue. So you have good market access, but also for project financiers outside, it's also a way of diversifying risk that you can invest in Africa to diversify away from wherever you are investing in. So it's in terms of the market here, we don't have a big debt. It's a smaller, so we can absorb more debt for project finance. And as I said, in terms of risk profile, risk return, when you invest in Africa, you are likely going to get more return compared to the same amount, same project invested elsewhere. I want to talk about sources of project finance, which are commercial banks, multilateral lenders, but you can also get project finance from development banks, export credit agencies. They help to de-risk projects, to give confidence. FDB has been one of the sources, as well as World Bank, IFC, and Investec Management. These are companies that can help in providing project finance. For you to access project finance, you go into stages, which is the negotiations with your off-takers, who is government, and then your buyers. Then you go through a bidding process, you get the contract, you negotiate, you sign, you go into a financial closure. This one is very complicated. Financial closure sometimes can even take a year, where you're trying to ensure that the financiers now are convinced. Then you go to construction and then service delivery. I talked about bankability. I will not go more, but I wanted to just mention that when we talk about bankability, you are looking at not just the project itself being attractive, but you are also looking at balancing that the lenders' interests are taken into account, the sponsors are taken into account, and then the users also. You want to make sure that you balance, because you can have a project which looks nice in numbers, but if the users cannot afford it. So bankability also looks at affordability issues at the same time. And in terms of affordability, you want to make sure that you can afford to pay for the price, you can afford to build the project, and then the populace can afford to pay the service. And this affordability is not just about today, but you look at the whole life cycle. You can come up with a project which you think can afford today, but 10 years down the line, you find that you are worried. You are not able to service the debt. So you need to look at the risk affordability, the affordability area for the whole life cycle. I will talk about financial modeling, where we are looking at a document that you take to the bank. So you're looking at your investments, you're looking at the assumptions that you are putting in there, you test them through sensitivity as well. I just want to give an example. For example, when you have a financial model, you have to look at your assumptions in terms of duration, your capital, your volume, price, costs, inflation, discount rate, interest rate, debt repayment. So with all that, you put numbers. So assume that you've put all your numbers, then you come up with the assumptions here. In terms of debt equity, you also have to share that how much am I going to finance, and you have your target rate of return. So those are some of the assumptions. Let's say you've done that, and then you find that you need 50 million to construct the project, and then you project that within a period of 20 years, you get some cash flows. If you discount those cash flows, let's assume that after being discounted at 10% as your weighted average cost of capital, you find 48. So if you find 48, then you actually see that in terms of the this one I should not look at it as the revenue, but let's look at the costs. If you're looking at this as the cost of operating, so if you look at this as the cost of operating, you look at the construction cost, then what it's really going to cost you is 98. So in other words, with project finance, you look at the whole life cycle. With normal financing, like traditional financing, like government, all they will look at is 50 million. So they will say we are building we are building this infrastructure, and the cost is 50 million, and they'll be happy. Now, when private sector comes, they will say no, the cost is 98 million. They will not be happy. They will say it's expensive. But if you really look at what happens when the government builds this infrastructure, 3 years down the line, it starts falling apart because there's no maintenance. While here, it takes into account the whole life cycle costs. So your real cost of the project is not just the 50, but also what you're going to cost to maintain. But the other thing that you also look is the risk impact. You come up with different risks and you isolate the higher risks and say that if the risk is catastrophic, how much will it increase the project costs? So that's that table. I will not go into details in explaining because of time, but I wanted to just say that at the end of it all, you look at the risk impact, but you also look at the probability of the risk occurring. Then you come up with a weighted probability cost. So if it was going to cost you another 200, if you have a catastrophic risk, then it means that if the probability is 20, then the cost that you're going to put in the project as an additional cost for risk will be 40. So you see that your project will go up by 50%. So it goes to 150% because you've added an element of risk. That's what private sector will do. So I will talk about risks a little bit, that it's part of the infrastructure project. Every big infrastructure project will have risks. Some of the risks that we talk about in infrastructure is the currency risk, demand risk. Do you have the people to buy? Political risk. It happens. I think one risk that we need to add here is corona risk. But anyway, ideally, it's called force majeure risk. I think it will be part of force majeure. Economic risk, construction, these are some of the risks that you want to ensure that you've taken into account. So for the bigger risks, actually, you assess them and you quantify them. So you can come up with different ways of doing it. You can use quantitative methods or qualitative methods. You can use Monte Carlo simulation. This is where you run probabilities in a model, or you can use decision tree where you're just looking at, okay, if this happens, what would be the impact, what would be the cost, and how do we proceed? So those are some of the ways, and then you prioritize them in terms of priority, in terms of importance, but also impact. So if you think it is a high priority, then you have to run further tests to make sure that you've taken mitigating measures if it happens. And when you identify your risks, you can decide your responses. So one of the response would be to change your project plan, to maybe improve, maybe to train people, to make sure that you avoid that risk, or to transfer. Transferring, you can transfer through insurance. You can also mitigate risk by bringing, for example, if it's a new project, you can even bring in temporary support like supervisors, in-house technical assistance to make sure that you mitigate the risk that would have happened if it was just left to the people. Or you can accept the risk. There are some, you cannot sell away all risks. There are some risks that you just have to accept, but you have to build it within your budget that should it happen, this is how we are going to finance. So in terms of project finance, you are likely going to pay several costs. Construction, they are going to put a certain percentage during the construction period. So you can say LIBOR plus maybe 1% during construction period. After construction, the risk is going to reduce. So during operation, you can have another price of the financing because the risk is lower. So you can say maybe -1. To ensure that the interest rate you are paying is now lower. Then there are some upfront fees that you have to pay, arrangement, legal fees. There are so many fees, quite frankly, that you pay in project finance. And lastly, we are looking at the project financing term, where we will look at different key clauses in there. I will not go through all of them, but this just gives you an overview that there's a long document. Sometimes it can be 50 pages or sometimes more of the terms. So you have the borrower, the arranger, and then you go further to look at issues of disbursements, issues of step-in rights. In terms of step-in rights, you're looking at the right of the lender to come and take over the project if you fail. So that you have to build it in there, and you're looking at lien over the assets. You can the lender can have a lien of over the assets if you're failing to pay, or they will be but not necessarily to take away the assets, but that they will be paid from the cash flow if you fail to pay properly or you are failing to. We are going to look, you also agree on issues of interest, commitment fees. I think we've talked about this already. Prepayment conditions. This is something that you need to look at very, very carefully. You can enter into in a rush into a project. You discover that now at the end, you have found a better deal. For you to prepay them and go back, you look at this clause. Sometimes it can be taxing. It can really tire you because it will be very expensive. So you need to see what are the terms. You need to, but there's also the issue of distribution. When the cash flows come, there's something that we call cash flow waterfall, where there is a priority on how you're going to distribute. So the first is the money comes, first of all, it has to prioritize debt service. But then before debt service, you look at OPEX. Maybe let me share with you this slide where first of all, the money comes, then you have to make sure that the operation is going. So you set aside money for operations, because at least the lenders are sure that if the operations are going on, then they know they can be paid. So the next is debt. So if there's any money left over, it goes to taxes. If any money left over, it goes to the profits as equity investors. So there are also restrictions that you are restricted when you go into project finance, and you have events of default, security issues, warranty issues, and you have debt service. You have to keep a certain amount of debt service. So, for example, like debt service coverage ratio, you're looking at your earnings before your EBITDA, earnings before interest and tax, and then you are looking at your debt service. So you have to agree on a ratio. How much should the ratio be? So in this case, they want to make sure that in your account you actually have the money that you are keeping. So this is a debt service. You can have a reserve. So you have major accounts. So you can have an account where you're just keeping money for debt service, and you want to have an account even here for maintenance, major maintenance. You want to reserve also. And sometimes you want to keep something for interest protection if it is a variable interest, and you want to make sure you have got a reserve for your independent engineer and then governing law. So at this point, I would like to say thank you so much for paying attention, and maybe if we have questions, we can go there.
Well, there were a couple questions from the audience, so I can ask those if you'd like. Very early in the presentation, Kenny had asked, his question was, blended finance is said to hold promise for financing. How effective do you think it's capable of solving Africa's infrastructure financing issues?
I missed the beginning. You're saying?
There's a question about blended finance. Blended finance is said to hold promise for financing. How effective do you think it's capable of solving Africa's infrastructure financing issues?
Well, I believe that blended finance is capable of solving the infrastructure project. I mean, the infrastructure gap as an addition, because we need to look at several alternatives of financing in the infrastructure. So we cannot just rely on one. But I see blended finance as one of the options that you can also look at, because in terms of because it's all about the cost of financing. So you're trying to find financing that is cheaper, that will make the project affordable eventually. So I think so I would say every kind of financing that comes, including blended finance, is effective in assisting infrastructure projects. It's just a question of making sure that when you get the financing, you are able to you're able to justify bankability based on the projected cash flows that are coming.
Okay, there was another question then from Ashley. Her question is, what infrastructure projects should African governments fund and what infrastructure projects should the private sector target?
Yeah, mostly the infrastructure projects which governments should fund are mostly those that are social in nature, that will not really generate any returns. And private sector should also focus on the infrastructure projects that are income generating and they are likely going to bring profits. Nevertheless, even with the infrastructure projects, the private sector the social projects, the private sector can still fund. What's required is that government will have to recognize that it is its role in the first place to provide social infrastructure. So it means that there has to be a way of minimizing the investment from the private sector. So, for example, the private sector can fund the whole amount of the social project. But what that means is that government should be ready to act as an off-taker to pay for the infrastructure. I'll give you an example of one project that we are doing in Malawi, which is construction of a house of student accommodation. For the investor to come and construct the student accommodation, the investment which they will put there, and for them to charge the school fees, the rent per month for a student, it is unaffordable. It is not possible. But then for the investor, they will be charging it because they are not giving you the bed space, but they are also selling you the infrastructure to you piecemeal on a month by month basis. Because at the end of the contract, the investor will just walk away. So in such case, you would find that it would be good for government to put in some money to reduce the costs that the student will pay so that the investor can charge a little bit. So even for social projects, private sector can also come. But the obvious answer that without any additional intervention would be the commercially viable projects, such as the telecom, energy, water. Those would be the key infrastructure projects.
Okay, thank you. Your friend Joyce, who you noted earlier in the presentation, had a question, so I'll read hers. She says, one important issue is the need for proper early project preparation for the project to be bankable. This is a challenge for many African countries. How can you advise African countries on how proper early project preparation?
Yeah, and that is very true. The challenge comes from many angles. One, the skills. Does Africa have enough skills for project preparation? Because you will notice that a lot of projects that we do, we actually ask international advisors. So I think my advice would be the need for capacity building for Africans to be able to carry out feasibility studies. And in terms of project preparation, the important thing is that you need to identify the funding for project preparation early and start working on it, because one of the stumbling blocks in preparation, it becomes funding. And you also need, in my opinion, to also don't be scared. You need to start small, even with small projects. For example, I will give you an example that we are doing a project that we are doing right now in the city of Blantyre, where I live. We have parks that are managed by the city assembly, but then they've been neglected. They don't have resources to manage them properly, and we need private sector to come and invest and manage. But then we were constrained with resources on project preparation. And we've been talking about this project for a while. But then now, because we have certified PPP specialists in our organization, we just assembled a team within ourselves to do the feasibility study ourselves. And I think by next month, we should have the advert in the paper looking for private sector. So the project preparation is something that I would say that besides relying on investors also, we should also build capacity. And building capacity is done by doing it. You need to do. There's a project that we also did for a game reserve where we did the feasibility, even the hostels project that I'm talking about, the student accommodation, we did the feasibility study ourselves. So I want to say that there are some projects which are very complex. I will talk about the hydropower project that we are doing with the 350 megawatts. I don't think we have the skills within to be able to come up with a proper feasibility study for building a dam in the middle of a river. So I think those will always rely on international experts. But I think for a lot, I would say it's time to build capacity in Africa for us as Africans to be able to prepare projects. And we just have to start. You can only learn by doing.
Okay. Got a couple more questions. Let's see, we're running a bit long on time, but let's ask one more. Josephine says, what's your view on some of the stringent environmental monitoring requirements that are sometimes onerous to comply with given the situation in Africa?
The stringent requirements that come from whom?
Environmental monitoring requirements.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're right. I've noted that, especially World Bank, especially World Bank, they put very, very stringent social and environmental impact assessments. Well, quite frankly, I don't have the background of World Bank, but what I know is that at the end, you want a project that will protect, that will deliver the service, but also protect the environment as well as protect the citizens. I'll go back to the example that I talked about the lake, the hydro project that we are doing. In that project, we are constructing a dam, and that dam is about 301 megawatts that will come there. Now, that dam, if you just operate it on its own, there's a risk that when you open the gates, it will flood downstream. It will take away maybe the aqua life as well as it can even animals, the wild, the livestock and the community. People can really flood. And as a result of the study of the social and environmental impact, we came up with a secondary dam and we called it a regulatory dam. So the water will flow into the secondary dam to be released slowly, going down compared to if there was no social and environmental impact, we could have come up with a project that would have been disastrous. You have people that are in the communities, they've got livelihood. You need to take into consideration. So I would say that I agree with you. I find them stringent and complicated and sometimes too long and expensive for that matter. But then at the end, I think they are addressing something which is good for the project. Again, I would like to emphasize the need for capacity building for Africa, because I think it would be important that as Africans, we should have enough skills that these studies, we should do them ourselves, so that when the project comes, we have already done these studies and we are able to take a project which is socially and environmentally free.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Victor. He asks, how has the legal system in your country evolved to support the development of project finance and protect the investors?
How did they what?
How has the legal system in Malawi evolved to support?
Well, I think in terms of the legal system for project finance, there are two angles. The first one is the aspect where the project finance is used for infrastructure development that are linked with the public sector. So this is the public-private partnerships. So in that front, we actually have a public-private partnership act and a policy as well that regulates project finance and infrastructure development. But then over and above that, as I said, project finance is not just for public-private partnerships, it is also for other private investments. So in terms of the legal framework, it just depends on the sector where you're investing. If you're investing in ICT, then we have the regulatory institution that regulates ICT, and we also have the legal framework in the ICT sector. If it is transport, again, we have the transport sector act that regulates, and it's split actually. We have the Railway Act, we have the roads, the act regulating the road sector, and we also have a regulation for the marine sector as well as aviation. So in the various sectors, we have the legal, but I think maybe where I think we still need to do a little more is on the transport sector. I think we need to have an independent regulatory body that will facilitate. But otherwise, we have regulatory bodies in the energy sector and in the communications sector as well. And we also need one in the water sector.
Let's wrap up with one final question. This is one that we get all the time at the ILI. I think every project finance course I've been involved with, every project course I've been involved with. So this is a good one from Washington. One key stakeholder is politicians. How best can they be managed so as to not negatively affect project delivery?
Yeah. I, I think the politicians can be managed in various ways. One of them is directly engaging them and explaining the project. Because remember, a politician is someone who wants to show results. They want to show that they are in politics and they are doing something to develop the nation. So their objective is not to stifle the project, but they want to take glory out of the project. So my way of managing the politician is directly engaging them and taking them through the projects, showing them what we are doing. In fact, the other one will also be general public awareness. I think this morning I was being interviewed by two TV stations where we were talking about an ICT project that we are doing. So one way of managing politicians is to take these projects out in the open for the general public to know what is happening. Then the general public will be going to the politicians to force them to ask, where is the project? We've heard that you as government are doing this project. Where is the project? So public awareness, engaging the whole public is also good to help to manage the politician. But I think the important thing also is to make sure that when you are doing infrastructure projects, they should not be seen as political projects. They are independent institutions that should handle the projects so that they should be delivered in that manner. Because if you are going to go with projects as political projects, the challenge will be the time span, and it may compromise the whole process. So it requires also you as project implementers to be strong in terms of your professionalism, to make sure that you follow the right processes. But what I've seen is that most politicians, if they are given the right facts, they will be able to buy into the processes. That, for example, right now, as I'm talking, in our country, our power capacity installed at the moment is about 400. What we are actually producing is less than 300 because of water issues and the other challenges. And as I'm telling you right now, we need power as today. But the reality is that we are handling a project that will bring 350 megawatts of power, but that's not today. It will take 4 years. So it's now a question of now engaging the politicians to show them the process, that it just doesn't happen overnight. These are the processes that we follow. So I think the engagement will be the right thing, in my opinion, because if they see, then they'll also talk your language.
Well, thank you for that answer, all those answers, and thank you, Audrey, for the full presentation today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. A reminder, the event was recorded. We will release it in a couple days on our website, which is www.ili.org. You'll be able to find that there. You can find our whole COVID-19 webinar series there as well. There's a number of free videos. You can learn about our courses as well. But thank you all for attending. Thank you again, Audrey.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much, ILI team. And special thanks to all the participants from America and Africa and from wherever you are. Thank you very much.